There is a photograph taken just hours after the Titanic sank of an iceberg floating alone in the North Atlantic. It has a long red smear across its base, a streak of paint. Nobody photographed it because they thought it was important. A ship's captain, passing by the next morning with no idea what had happened the night before, snapped it simply because it looked strange. Only later did anyone realize what that red streak probably was. That is not the story you already know about the Titanic. You know about the iceberg, the band playing as the ship went down, women and children first, and the movie. But almost everything most people know about this disaster is either incomplete, oversimplified, or flat out wrong. Tonight, forget the movie. Forget the myths. What you're about to hear are the details historians argue about, the survivors nobody remembers, and the decisions made in the space of minutes that decided who lived and who didn't. By the end of this video, you will understand the Titanic not as a legend, but as a series of very human, very avoidable mistakes. Let's start with the word everyone associates with this ship, unsinkable. Almost every account of the Titanic repeats the same idea, that White Star Line loudly marketed the ship as unsinkable, and that this arrogance doomed her. But dig into the primary sources, and the claim barely exists before the disaster. The word appeared once, in a trade magazine describing the ship's watertight compartment design as making her practically unsinkable. White Star Line itself never used the word in its advertising campaigns. The myth of the boastful, arrogant company advertising invincibility was largely constructed afterward by journalists and by the public searching for someone to blame. The real failure wasn't marketing hubris. It was something far more mundane, a design that was strong but not tested against the specific way disaster actually struck. Here's a detail rarely mentioned. The ship's lookouts, stationed in the crow's nest, were supposed to have binoculars. On the night of April 14th, they had none. Why? A few weeks before departure, an officer named David Blair was reassigned off the ship at the last minute. In his rush to leave, he accidentally took the key to a storage locker with him, a locker that happened to contain the crow's nest binoculars. Nobody realized until it was too late. Lookout Frederick Fleet later testified that with binoculars, he might have spotted the iceberg further out, perhaps enough time to steer clear entirely. A misplaced key, carried off by a man who wasn't even supposed to leave, may have contributed to one of history's worst maritime disasters. Most people know the Titanic sent distress signals. Fewer know that another ship, the Californian, was close enough, some estimates say 10 to 20 miles away, to potentially see the Titanic's distress rockets. Crew members on the Californian did see white flares in the distance that night, but the ship's wireless operator had switched off his equipment and gone to bed roughly 10 minutes before the Titanic's first distress call went out. The officers on watch debated what the flares might mean, but ultimately dismissed them as company signals or fireworks, and did nothing. The Californian's failure to respond became one of the most controversial chapters of the entire disaster. A ship that might have saved hundreds, sitting still in the dark. There's a woman named Jessop whose story sounds almost impossible. She was working aboard the Titanic's sister ship, the Olympic, in 1911 when it collided with a British warship, and she survived that collision unharmed. The following year, she was working as a stewardess aboard the Titanic itself, and survived its sinking by escaping in a lifeboat. 4 years later, during the First World War, she was serving as a nurse aboard the Britannic, the Titanic's other sister ship, when it struck a mine and sank. She survived that too, reportedly jumping from a lifeboat that was about to be pulled into the ship's still turning propellers. 3 sister ships, 3 disasters, 1 survivor who lived to be nearly 84 years old, largely unbothered by fame, working quietly for decades afterward. Survival in freezing North Atlantic water was measured in minutes, not hours. Most victims who ended up in the sea died of hypothermia within 20 to 30 minutes. Yet the ship's chief baker, Charles Juffin, reportedly survived in the water for around 2 hours before being pulled onto an overturned lifeboat. His own explanation was startlingly simple. Before the ship went down, expecting the worst, he had been drinking whiskey steadily to calm his nerves. Some historians suggest the alcohol may have offered him a strange, temporary edge against the cold, though most modern medical opinion is skeptical that this fully explains his survival. Whatever the reason, Juffin outlived the disaster by decades, dying peacefully in 1956. The man the icy Atlantic somehow couldn't finish off. 6 Chinese passengers were aboard the Titanic, traveling in 3rd class. 5 of them survived, a strikingly high survival rate. Yet when they reached New York, they were barred from disembarking under the Chinese Exclusion Act, quickly transferred onto another ship, and sent away from the United States within roughly 24 hours, with almost no chance to speak to reporters or officials. For over a century, they were largely written out of Titanic history, sometimes even accused, without evidence, of having disguised themselves as as women to get onto lifeboats. Only in recent years have researchers and documentary filmmakers worked to correct the record and tell their actual stories, including a survivor named Fong Lang, who was pulled half-frozen from the water after clinging to a floating door. A Japanese civil servant named Masabumi Hosono was one of the few Japanese passengers aboard the Titanic. He survived by getting into a lifeboat. When he returned home, instead of being welcomed with relief, he was publicly shamed. Japanese newspapers and even a textbook criticized him for not going down with the ship, framing his survival as a betrayal of samurai-era ideals of honorable death. He lost his government job and lived the rest of his life under a cloud of public disgrace, despite having done nothing wrong except surviving. It wasn't until decades after his death that Japanese historians and the public began to reassess his story with more sympathy. One of the most quietly scandalous details of the disaster involves Lifeboat 1. It had room for 40 people. It left the sinking ship carrying just 7 crew members and 5 passengers, several of them wealthy first-class travelers. Rumors spread almost immediately that the crew had been bribed by passengers to row away quickly rather than risk turning back for survivors in the water. The lifeboat became known in the press as the Money Boat. A British inquiry later investigated the claims directly, though the accused passengers denied wrongdoing and were never formally punished. Whatever the full truth, the lifeboat remains one of the starkest symbols of how unevenly chance, class, and self-interest shaped who got a seat that night. The Titanic's band is famous for playing music as the ship sank, but one detail is less well known. The bandleader, Wallace Hartley, was engaged to be married, and his fiancée had given him a violin as a gift. That violin was reportedly recovered still strapped to his body when it was found floating in the Atlantic days later. It eventually made its way back to his fiancée, then passed through private hands for generations, largely forgotten. In 2013, after years of forensic authentication, it was sold at auction for over £1 million, becoming, by some estimates, the most valuable Titanic artifact ever sold and quite possibly the most valuable musical instrument connected to any historical disaster. In 1898, an author named Morgan Robertson published a novel called Futility. It described a giant, supposedly unsinkable ocean liner called the Titan, which strikes an iceberg in the North Atlantic and sinks, with most passengers dying due to a shortage of lifeboats. The fictional ship's size, speed, and fate were eerily close to the real Titanic's, down to details like the month of the crossing. The novel was written 14 years before the actual disaster. It's not prophecy. Robertson understood shipbuilding trends and safety shortcuts common at the time, but the resemblance is close enough that the book still unsettles readers who discover it today. The Titanic didn't sink because of one iceberg, one arrogant boast, or one villain. It sank because of a chain of small, human failures: a missing key, a sleeping radio operator, a captain who didn't turn back, a lifeboat that left half empty. Every one of those failures had a name attached to it, a person who made an ordinary decision on an extraordinary night. That's what makes the story endure, not the size of the ship, but the size of the choices made by very small, very human people. If this is the first time you've heard some of these stories, you're not alone. Most people never do, and that's exactly why they deserve to be told. If you want more stories like this, the details history almost let slip away, stay close, because there's a lot more beneath the surface than anyone tells